Our initial explorations in rabbit holes through class discussion led us to consider the representations and memorialisation of slave traders in the city of Bristol. This stemmed from the second week class readings by Christine Ackerman about Perry's Bridge, which led us to further explore how people involved in the slave trade are memorialised through landmarks, buildings and streets. This led us to look at Abraham Elton, who owned multiple slave ships funded through metalwork industries. Elton used his industrial profits to buy enslaved Africans and invested in at least 3 slave trade voyages. We then looked at Colston, who is now well known for his role in the slave trade as a senior executive of the Royal African Company. Colston used his profits from this to invest in philanthropic projects across Bristol, leaving a contested legacy which has caused much debate over removing, renaming and readdressing his presence.
We began this project and introduction into Bristol as a place with the Miles Chambers poem Bristol, Bristol that was shown to us in our first tutorial. The quotation that stood out to us the most was Bristol, Bristol, a place still haunted by the ancestral ghosts that echoes the historical hangover that yet sobered us up to what time hasn't changed. This quote gave us the initial impression that through the multicultural, bright, dynamic and accepting atmosphere Bristol is presented with, it is shadowed by a terrible history that is ingrained within the society and entrenched within Bristol's infrastructure.
Looking further into our rabbit hole, we took the historical understanding of Colston's image and presence in the city into a more recent context. The famous toppling of Colston statue as part of the International Black Lives Matter protests in 2020 was only the start of a wider conversation regarding the prevalence of the slave trader and philanthropist's name in a modern city such as Bristol. This changing representation, which has been brewing in Bristol for many years previously, sparked our interest and encouraged deeper research in this area. Our focus then changed direction during week 5 when we learned about the Bristol bus boycotts. We were interested in how it affected the speed of equality progress in Bristol due to its colonial history, creating a racist discourse surrounding the Windrush generation. After a further simple internet search combining Colston and the Bristol bus boycott, we unearthed a connection through a stained glass window located in St Mary Redcliffe Church. The windows previously dedicated to Colston had been removed completely and are set to be replaced with aspects of Bristol's history. Further online research provided little more information, but our field trip to Bristol allowed us to investigate the church itself and subsequently narrowed down our line of inquiry as we were starting to think about how the memorialisation of Colston has had effects on Black lives in Bristol since.
During the field trip, we took the opportunity to visit the sites that linked to our line of inquiry. First, following up the link between the bus boycott and Colston we discovered online in week 5, we went to St Mary Redcliffe Church to visit the stained glass windows which had been taken down and explored further. Then we considered the wider representation of Colston throughout Bristol's churches and how the church has been memorialising and benefiting from him and his role in colonial history. We then decided to visit Bristol Cathedral to continue our investigation of Colston's representation in churches, where we saw 2 exhibitions dealing with decolonisation and Colston. One of these was a collection of painted spheres outside the cathedral. We discovered that the work being displayed reflected many Black Bristolians' thoughts on Bristol, such as the artist Jasmine Thompson. This exhibition was only part of the cathedral's work towards decolonisation.
After seeing the stained glass window, we drew a link to Krang's 1996 article on Bristol as a palimpsest city, referring in this case to a landscape that has been subjected to amendment and modification over time. Currently, the St Mary Redcliffe Church has a display detailing the absence of the lower glass windows and the reason for Colston's image removal. It states that the fall of the Colston statue on the 7th of June 2020 was a signal to finally take action to reconsider Bristol's history and highlight significance of the glass windows that are set to replace them in the cathedral. Perhaps once this display is taken down, the church's representation of Colston will then be seen as silently amended, and his previous large representation in the city will be less prominent. Interestingly, when we spoke to a church representative, he was unaware of when the window would be replaced or any details to do with Colston's image within the church, which could suggest that those who work in the church are still unaware on the topic. For the cathedral, the modified boarded up representation of Colston is particularly interesting as it shows, in accordance to Krang's palimpsest argument, a literal layered aspect of history. Unlike the St Mary Redcliffe Church, the large image of Colston remains prominently, and in addition to the display of spheres near the cathedral that were erected to bring awareness of Black History Month, the cathedral can be seen to acknowledge Colston's resounding impact on Bristol as a place, yet shows distaste for his role in the slave trade.
The Black History Month displayed outside the cathedral then became more interesting to us. The exhibition displayed spheres designed by local artists, all of different themes about Black history. One of the artists, called Three Doms, created a sphere about a society that can be created when we have a full understanding of our shared history and what Bristol could be like when it is properly acknowledged for its past. Whilst the cathedral's exhibition was a clear step in recognition of the church's involvement in colonial legacy, it was interesting to us that this exhibition was only available for Black History Month, when it is much more relevant to Bristol's colonial history when recognising its problematic past in a progressive form. This led us to question whether the exhibition was more of a political performance, and so with these questions in mind, we then went into the cathedral.
After talking to a Bristol Cathedral employee, we learned about how, despite Colston's name being boarded up on the stained glass windows, there are still other historical figures with involvement in the slave trade memorialised in the church. We decided we wanted to investigate this further, and we discovered that 200 people memorialised in the cathedral had connections to the slave trade. However, because of their lack of fame in comparison to the politicisation of Colston's name, they go unnoticed by many, despite their horrific history. One of those is Robert Codrington, who is memorialised via a statue in the cathedral. The Codrington family owned plantations in Barbados and were delegated to the Society of the Propagation of the Gospel in foreign parts. This highlights how the church had a direct connection in the slave trade as they helped to manage plantations. Members of the Codrington family also supported the church through bequeathments, with most of this money being generated through the family business that used slaves. The presence of Codrington in the church does not seem as politicised in comparison to Colston, despite being equally connected to the slave trade. Yet, like Colston, the Codrington family name is still prevalent in Bristol, with streets such as Codrington Road still bearing his name. This name is not as recognised as Colston, and the church is yet to remove the family statue, but is this due to less public demand? This led us to question why the cathedral and churches in Bristol have taken a very public stance against Colston after the Black Lives Matter protests, but not other troubling figures in Bristol and the church's history. So, it is clear that there is a disparity in the accountability of historical figures that are memorialised within the church.
Following the field trip, we found we had consolidated our earlier ideas and developed a more focused area of research. We engaged in academic readings such as historical revisions in the church and Bristol as a palimpsest city to deepen understanding on the relationship between representations of slave traders and the city and the church in Bristol. Richard's paper considered changing attitudes on Colston from a saint-like philanthropist cited in sermons as a role model and compared to the Good Samaritan in the original St Mary Redcliffe glass window, with changing perceptions on his role in the slave trade becoming more common knowledge, and churches in Bristol eventually recognising their fabric and ministries benefited financially from slave traders, including Colston. This was particularly interesting to us following the discovery that Colston was one of around 200 benefactors of the cathedral who were associated with slavery. So the fact that Colston is the only named offender does perhaps show a certain degree of performative reactions from the church, only condemning the high-profile Colston in order to improve public opinion.
Having consolidated our ideas from the field trip, we turned to formulating our research question. We started with a broad idea of researching Colston and the legacy of slavery within the church, and explored more specific lines of inquiry further down the rabbit hole. The paper on Colston by Samuel J. Richards points out that most debates on the news around memorialisation focuses on universities such as Oxford and Cambridge and government properties, but similar debates also occur in churches. This lack of wider publicity in many cases suggests that this is a relevant and opportune area of study where perhaps there is more of a gap in the research. In formulating a research question, we found that it was often changing after each line of inquiry as our interests started specialising. However, our research questions were still too broad. Richard Andrews' research question book was helpful in helping us understand how to narrow down a research question in conjunction with the narrowing down of our lines of inquiry so that we could produce a question that would progress our research. Similarly, watching Clyde Barnett's advice on using how questions instead of why in order to generate a more specific answer was also helpful. Both sources changed how we started thinking about what our question could be, from thinking about why Colston is so politicised by the church and bring to the Black Lives Matter movement, to looking at how the church has reacted to Colston compared to other slave traders post the forced removal of the Colston statue. The research question we decided to pursue is, how does the change in Edward Colston's representation in Bristol's churches differ to other prominent slave traders?
If we were to look further into actually answering the question, we would initially put further research into how influential the other slave traders were at the time in colonial history, as well as talking to representatives of the church to inquire more about if they plan to remove or modify the other slave traders' images in the future too, due to public social demand. Finally, here are our Bristol field trip photos, and here is our reference list.